Good afternoon from Barcelona. My name is Mike Rosenberg from IESE Business School. I'm a professor of strategy. It's 2 o'clock here in Barcelona. I understand it's about 8 a.m. in New York and about 8 p.m. in Shanghai. And I apologize to those watching from California because it's very, very early in the morning. Welcome to this. We've done a number of these webinars during the outbreak and during the crisis. Today, it's really a pleasure to welcome Núria Mas to the series. Núria, as many of you know, is the chairman of or chairwoman, excuse me, or the chair of our economics department. She is a member of the board of the governors of the Bank of Spain. She did her doctoral work at the Harvard Business School, and she's at Harvard University in their economics department, where she studied healthcare economics. I understand that her advisor went on to design Obamacare, so she's very much connected to the two things which are so critical to what we're doing now. One is health and the healthcare system, where she's been an advisor to the European Union, and also to the government of Catalonia, and economics, where she is a brilliant economist. So Núria, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Núria, where are we going? And there's been, I understand that there's a few new projections about the economic impact of this whole thing out right now. Maybe can you share those with us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So just yesterday, the IMF came out with its new projections on the impact of the coronavirus crisis in the whole economy. Just to give you an idea of what this has meant for all of us, let me start by just telling you what the IMF was saying in the month of January. Every 3 months, the IMF updates its projections on what's going to happen into the economy. And just in January, the expectations for 2020 were quite good. Actually, 2020 was supposed to be the recovery year, even though a small recovery compared to the growth that we were going to have in 2019. In 2019, the IMF was telling us that the growth of the whole economy was just barely below 3%, and 2020 was supposed to be growing at 3.3%, especially in emerging economies that were going to grow more, almost 4.5%. Now, with the coronavirus, the whole thing changed, and our economies were locked down and closed. And this changed completely the expectations that we have from 2020 to 2021. So basically, as we know, the number of cases, this is just recent data, it's about 2 million of people affected worldwide. And this, the impact of the virus is spreading everywhere. Now, what happens with
Núria, if I can interrupt you just for a moment, the 2 million people are the people who have been tested positive for the virus. So these are people who felt bad enough to go to the hospital to ask to get tested. What's not included in that number, if I understand it properly, is all the people who may be asymptomatic or may not feel so terrible or may not have found a way to get tested in an official place. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a very important point. Also, when we want to determine what's the mortality rate of the virus, because we honestly still don't know. Most of the people are asymptomatic and we don't know how many cases we have out there, but it's expected to be very many more than the ones that are being detected officially. Which would be,
in another one of these series, we had Magda Rosenmuller, and one of the points that she made was, if this is like other viruses, the mortality should be somewhere around 0.6 or 0.5%, which would mean that there might be 10 or 20 times more people out there with the virus. And of course, we won't know that until everything's done and epidemiologists come along and clean up all the data. But I think it's an important point because it's scary, but maybe it's not as scary as some of these numbers would indicate.
Exactly. The fact that we have this feeling that we are not detecting everybody and that we are missing so many people, it's actually good news in this aspect. But still, I mean, it's true that we cannot say if it's going to be 0.6, 0.8, we don't know until we have all this massive testing everywhere. But that's a very, very well taken point. You are absolutely right, and so is Magda as well. So some of the things that we know that now we come to accept globally is that the way in which we can contain the impact that this virus is going to have on our healthcare systems is basically by taking some level of lockdown, basically staying at home up to some point. What this graph shows is the number of critical care beds that we will need in black if we don't do anything. And that's clearly way too many. Many more than the ones that our systems have. The more we try to contain our movements, the more we lock down, the lower the number of intensive care beds we will need at the same time. Okay, so this is something that we have come to accept. But what this means is that basically, in order to contain the virus, we need to take very many types of actions like travel restrictions, school closures, partial or total closing of businesses, and isolation. And this has a very big economic impact. And actually, for example, this is just one way of showing you what it means for some of the sectors. The data that we have in our right, it's the number of total restaurant dinners that have just been decreasing in different countries all over the world, just to signal the massive impact that this lockdown is having in some very particular sectors of the economy. So what is actually happening in this crisis is that we have these different types of curves that are important to save lives, which are the type of containment that we need to do in our economy. If we don't do any protective measure, we will have something like the red curve, which we have come to know and accept widely right now. Okay, we will have a lot of cases, very concentrated, and that will be a very important strain in our healthcare systems. Now,
And
if
Nuria,
we
this is what happened in Wuhan, in northern Italy, in Madrid, and perhaps to a slightly lesser extent in Barcelona, and now it's happening in New York City.
this is happening, actually, I would say that what happened in Madrid, maybe it's not even the red, it's a little bit less because some containment measures have already started, okay? But the red would be in the extreme case where we don't do anything. And clearly this would be overboard. Now, if we try to stay at home, to use a little bit less the public transportation and things like that, we can slow down the impact that this is going to have in our healthcare systems, which is something absolutely desirable for protecting life. Okay. The problem that this has is that this has almost a mirror image on the impact of the economy. The more we lock down our economies, the worse the impact this is going to have in our GDP. And it's very hard to find the balance. It's almost impossible to find the balance between these two situations. It's a very tough decision. Okay, so basically what the governments and the different institutions are trying to do now is to say, okay, we are locking it down either completely or partially, and then we are going to implement some measures to protect this. With this in mind, then, what has happened in all the economies around the world that have different levels of lockdown is that the impact has been very bad for our GDP. And these are the new projections that the IMF has come up with in just yesterday. Okay, so basically what the IMF anticipates for 2020, it's a global decrease in the GDP of 3%. Mm-hmm. Just to put that in context, keep in mind that with the global financial crisis, the slowdown was 0.1%. Okay, now after that, we see a recovery of 5.8% for the global world. Now, this slowdown is going to be very important in advanced economies that are going to decrease more than 6%. And countries like mine or Italy are going to have a massive shock. For example, Spain, according to the IMF, this year could see its GDP shrinking by 8% and Italy by more than 9%. And then we have emerging economies that are also going to have a negative growth.
Sorry, could you say that again, Núria? The impact in Spain and Italy might be that the GDP decreases by 8. What does that really mean to people? What does that mean in real life? That sounds like a bad number.
It is definitely a bad number. On the positive side, you can see the increase in the projections in 2021, which basically says after you've stopped producing, well, you've touched bottom. Then the next year can only be better. That's basically what these numbers are telling us. Okay, it's not. But that's why I want to stop here for 1 second, because even with the recovery that we see in 2021, if you look at what this is going to mean for the GDP in the different economies, the red is what would have happened to emerging markets had the COVID not taken place. And the blue is for advanced economies. What we can see is first this massive drop in our lives, in the lockdowns of many of our countries, and then the recovery after that. But as you can see, this recovery, it's not enough to reach the level of GDP that we would have had anyway had this not happened. Okay, and actually the IMF estimates that we would be losing a total of $9 trillion globally because of this crisis. This is just an estimate. Okay.
Now, these projections come out. A couple of weeks ago, we had one of our finance professors, Nuno Fernandes, who built his kind of own model and his own understanding of things. And I thought he was a little bit alarmist at the time. Do you believe these numbers? Do you think this is actually going to happen? I see it as a little bit alarmist, but maybe I don't know. Should we take this as true, or is this something we just need to think about?
For me, the numbers per se, if you take them as a number, don't make much sense. Let me tell you what I mean with that, okay? They, of course, help us think, but for me, the important thing, especially in situations like this one, is to build up our mental scenarios. So let me show you what I mean with that, just for the case of Spain, and take it as just a simple example with a very, it's not even a model, it's just playing a little bit with some numbers, okay? So imagine this 8% that the IMF is talking about. What would that mean for our lives, as you were asking a little bit before? What's this consistent with? Well, what we have here, it's all the month, for example, for Spain, January, February, March, April, okay? And then here we can imagine a little bit which percentage of our economy could be locked down in every month. So in January or February, we actually have more businesses being created. That's the typical growth that we could be seeing in the Spanish economy. And then in March, we start seeing the impact of the coronavirus, maybe with a lockdown of 20% of our activities, which is going to last for a few months. That could be a potential scenario. If I believe that this month, 60% of the typical GDP production is going to be locked down because we are staying at home if our activity is non-essential, for instance, and then that the recovery is going to slowly take place and that will be fine in September when the kids can go back to school, that would be a plausible scenario, which is what I've just been drawing you here. That would take us to a total decrease in GDP loss of 8% for this year, for instance. Okay, and that's what I'm drawing here on the right. Now, this is one scenario.
And that's because the tourists who don't come in May are not coming in. I mean, even if they come next year in May, they still didn't come this year in May. So that money's gone. Is that basically
that one idea? Is gone, for example, or you are not going to eat all the times in the restaurants after the lockdown that you would have. Probably, I don't know if you will catch up or not, but that's hard, right? So, but what I'm trying to draw here is this is just one scenario that means this 8% GDP growth. Now, 8% per se doesn't mean anything unless it corresponds to something in your mind. Let me give you another scenario, which is another one that people are talking about. Imagine that this thing comes back in autumn. Then look at the graph that we have on the right. First, you have a loss. Then we get back to maybe some type of recovery in September, and then this thing comes back. Okay, so this
and the reason you say it might come back is because the Spanish flu did come back the following autumn. Is that correct? Is that the model that people are thinking about?
Well, what I'm trying to say here is, honestly, we don't know. We don't know if the people that get the virus are going to get immunized, for example, for the long term. That's a big question mark. We don't know whether we will have a treatment maybe before that. So there are many unknowns. So the only thing that I'm trying to tell you is that these numbers, behind these numbers, there are many assumptions of scenarios. So I rather see some scenarios than just the ballpark number per se. Because I can understand, for me, it's easier to figure out whether I believe the scenario that you are telling me or I believe another scenario, as opposed to the number. Of course, institutions need to give us the number. This is their job. But I think it's interesting also to try to understand a little bit what's behind these numbers. That's what I wanted to say.
Fantastic. But now the governments of the world are reacting, and I don't want you to say anything which is secret, because you are you do have an official role here in Spain. But what's your opinion about how the governments of the world are reacting to this crisis? Because they're trying to push more money into the system and trying to limit that economic impact, I guess. The governor of New York State, for example, said, well, we have a crisis, a health crisis we're going to solve, and then we'll start solving the economic crisis.
Well, I think that solving the healthcare crisis first, it's the immediate emergency that we all have, okay? And that goes back to the two curves that we have. But it's true that I think the best thing that we can say right now, given all the uncertainty, is that institutions, not only governments, but also central banks, have been reacting very quickly. If there's something we've learned from the very recent crisis, is the importance of reacting quickly when we have this type of problems. And this is something that we have been seeing. Why? Well, because the impact that this can have in different parts of our economy, it's going to be very serious. For example, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, is estimating the total impact that this crisis could have globally in unemployment as the equivalent of 195 million full-time workers. That's not the total impact on unemployment. They say that it's going to wipe out more than 6.5% of the working hours globally. Okay, so the impact is going to be very important. And that's why governments and institutions, central banks, for example, need to react very quickly. Now, what's puzzling in this situation is something that has never happened before. Usually when you have a crisis, governments are trained to try to push the demand up, to put things into the economy so that we can stimulate the economy. Right now, what's happening is that the governments are containing us. To save our life, we have been forced to actually make firms stop producing and keep people at home. And that's something very unique of this crisis.
Well,
And that's
Núria,
why
before you go on, so we had a session with the dean and a number of CEOs, and what was striking by them is some of them were stopped, and some of them were full speed ahead, and some of these CEOs actually had companies where part of their business was running, double digits and overtime making products for hospitals, while others are completely stopped. So which parts of the economy are going to get hit, which, how, and do we know that yet, or are we still trying to figure it out?
well, we are starting to get some important data on this and some indicators on which companies have been open and some that have been closed. This is an estimate from Moody's, which I think it's very interesting, and it's also very
Moody's is the credit rating
Moody's.
agency, right?
Moody's, the credit rating agency, exactly. Yes, and what they do is to look at which are the sectors that are going to be very highly hit by this, and then we can see that some will have a less impact on the crisis, and some might actually even profit, as you were saying, from the crisis. So, which sectors does Moody's say? And again, it's very intuitive with the data that we are seeing right now. Okay, which are going to have a high impact with the crisis? Apparel, airlines, any type of traveling, global shipping, and then the retail that it's non-food, basically because the stores are just simply closed. Okay, then some other sectors are going to be impacted in the medium range: oil and gas, beverages, agriculture, property, and so on. Below that, there will be some sectors that are also going to have a negative impact, and one of them is food and food retail. We might think we are eating a lot, but actually we are eating less than if we were just going outside and going to the restaurants and so on. In part also because many families are going to be suffering and are already suffering enormously with this crisis, and they've been reducing their consumption as well.
And what I understand is a lot of food companies have their retail division selling to supermarkets, and then a wholesale division selling to restaurants and other institutions. So the one
Exactly.
business is stopped, and then there's price pressure on the restaurant, on the food, on the supermarket chain. So you will have a negative impact on many companies in that sector, even though the supermarkets are full and people are still buying food.
Yes, exactly. And also, again, we cannot think that we are the average. That's the other part in this argument, okay? So one part is obviously restaurants and going out and so on, but then there's the part of families who are staying in, and some of them have been severely hit already with the crisis, so then their consumption might also be reduced as well. And then there will be very few sectors that actually are gonna be doing better. There will be winners of this crisis, like gold, flight to safety, online retail, and internet services, for example. Okay, so it's true that this is one crisis that it's affecting very different sectors very differently, and that's why it's so important that the policies are very target to sectors and very target to these people who suffer the most. Okay, because here we have a very, very different impact in the society that can increase inequalities across the different sectors.
We actually had a question from one of our viewers, I think through the LinkedIn site. By the way, if you do have questions, please type them into the chat function on YouTube or LinkedIn or La Vanguardia, wherever you're watching, and it will magically appear on my iPad because of some people from our alumni association who are making that happen. Adam Blanco asked from Florida, will this impact? Will this make inequality worse?
So that's a very important question, and actually, in the short term, probably. If you think about inequality, let me just mention two of these dimensions of inequality, okay? And especially since you said that he's asking from the US, I want to also keep in mind the environment of the healthcare system there, okay? So one of the things that we can say first is that the workers who work in particular sectors are going to be hit the worst. Not everybody can work from home. And usually, the less money you make, the less likely it is that you can work from home. That's not for absolutely everybody, but there's this type of correlation.
No, but I understand that, waiters and people in restaurants, people in the health clubs, people in the hotels, and in the American system, they've not been furloughed. They've just been sent home. They've been basically laid off.
Exactly. So in this sense, the economic inequality might increase, but there's something else to keep in mind as well. These workers who cannot telework and have not lost their job and they will go to work have a higher probability also, of course, of getting the disease. And that also means a different health impact for some groups of population. Okay, and some of these groups might not have the type of access to healthcare that we are thinking of, for example, in Europe, where we have universal coverage for everybody at zero cost of entry. That's different, for example, in the US. So the impact in health might also be different across different socioeconomic groups.
Yeah, they've told me that people are not getting tested because if you go to the hospital and ask for testing, that costs money. And depending upon your health insurance, it's not covered. And then if you are ill, they might keep you in the hospital and that might cost thousands and thousands of dollars. So many people who feel ill are just staying home and hoping for the best.
Exactly. That's why I think that actually having this universal healthcare coverage with zero access cost in Europe is actually going to have, in this particular crisis, a very positive impact in the population. Just because if you feel sick, you just go to the hospital and you don't have to worry about the possibility of being covered.
Now this is all about the West and kind of wealthy countries. How does this play out in the rest of the world? Because not everybody enjoys the kind of GDP or the privilege that we have in our life.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, just one thing that I just when we talk about the long run, I want to say also something else about inequality, which is a little puzzling. And if I forget, remind me, because I want to say something about that as well.
Okay.
When we think about other countries, absolutely. I mean, the impact is going to be very different, not only across sectors, also across workers and also across countries. So within advanced economies, the impact is going to be very different, as we have seen, but also in emerging economies is going to be very different. And again, it's going to be very different for many dimensions, but I want to talk about the ones that we have been mentioning. One, it's in terms of the health emergency. Not all the sectors, not all the countries even have the healthcare system resources to reply or to give an acceptable answer to this problem. Some of them, and I think that you might mention it to me once, don't even have more than 4, 3, 5 ventilators.
A group of students did a term project for me on health. And they've actually changed the nature of the project to do an analysis of the infrastructure in a number of emerging markets. And for example, they said that in South Sudan, there's only 4 respirators in the whole country. Now, the population is relatively young, but it's certainly something to worry about.
Yeah, but young people also get sick. Well, depends on what you mean with young, but starting at 40, people tend to also get sick. It's just that they recover, but they also need assistance in many cases. So obviously, this is one of the crises that we can just not even envision, right? The countries that don't even have enough resources in their healthcare systems to answer to the most basic needs, not only with the coronavirus, but also in other types of crisis. The next step on this is if we have a treatment, who will get access to it as well? So this is the next step. Okay, so this is in terms of health, but then in terms of the economy, there's something else also to keep in mind into emerging economies. Emerging economies that have the same type of health resources might be treated very differently in terms of their access to markets to get the financing that they will need to do, let's say, the fiscal policies that we were talking about before. Okay, so in this sense, we
Because
can have
different countries have different kind of levels of exposure to all these things like commodities and stuff, right?
exactly. So we might have different countries having very, very, very different access to financing from the rest. And here we can just keep in mind the typical 5 dimensions that we always discuss with our students here at IESE. So what makes you more risky? If you need financing from outside, you are more vulnerable. Needing financing from outside means that you have debt with the rest of the world. Not necessarily public debt. It can be private debt as well. If we think about Japan, for example, Japan is a country where the public debt is very big, more than 230% of the GDP. However, the Japanese companies, Japanese people save more than enough to finance this and still finance the rest of the world. Okay, so what matters is the total debt of the country. So if you are one country which has debt with the rest of the world, this is usually very closely related to the fact that you have been a net importer for a long time. Okay, that's one signal of vulnerability. The other thing that matters is whether this debt is short term or long term. If you have to pay this year, how are you going to do it? If you have 10 years to pay, who cares? Or at least you care a little bit less. Is this debt in your currency or is this debt in dollars? Because another thing that has happened with this crisis is this flight to quality. Many people, many investors have moved to gold, have moved to dollars, to quality. Okay, so if your debt is in dollars, now might be more expensive. Another thing that matters is, do you have enough reserves? Have you been accumulating foreign reserves to pay this debt back? Okay, because if you owe debt to foreigners, you have to pay them very soon and it's in dollars, but you have reserved, the problem is less. And then the other thing that is important is, do you have what we call the twin deficits? Is your government also very indebted? Yes or no? Because if the government is very indebted, in some countries where the institutions are not strong enough, you might see a pressure for the central banks in this country to print to pay for this debt. Okay, so the combination of these things, plus being very dependent on commodities, such as, for example, Angola, it's a very dependent on commodities country where 88% of their exports are related to oil. So being very
And the price
dependent
of
on
oil has
commodities.
dropped by 50% in the last couple of weeks. Is that right?
Exactly. So actually, here we can see how the price of very many commodities has gone down for very many reasons, some supply and some demand, but a lot of them have to do with a lot of the demand. If our economies are locked down, are closed, we need less of these commodities to produce, for example.
So
Okay.
Núria, before we go to some questions, because we got lots and lots of questions coming from people watching the program, what do you think is going to happen in the long term? You know, someday, because this storm will pass, and someday we'll get someplace else. You mentioned that it might have an impact on inequality, and you asked me to remind you about that. Where do you think all this is going to go someday?
Okay, so someday we don't know enough about what's happening to pandemias, but I found out about this research, which I think it's very interesting because this is from the Federal Reserve of San Francisco, and what they did was to look at all the pandemias that have been taking place in the world for which they have data, starting with the Black Death of the 1347 that took place in Europe, and that had a very big death toll. So from there, they've been looking at the impact that it has had, that crises have had, pandemias have had on the European economy in 2 dimensions, which are the ones for which we have data for the last hundreds of years, okay? And they've been looking at what happens to salaries and what happens to interest rates. And they found 2 interesting things. And that's why I said it's hopeful in some aspect. One thing that they found is that first, the impact of a pandemic lasts for a very long time. And in salaries, it lasts for 30 years, in interest rates for 20. This does not happen, for example, when we have a war. So wars, which are a very big crisis as well in the economy, have don't have these long-lasting effects. Okay, and then what do they find in these two dimensions? What they find is actually real salaries go up. Not a lot, but they go up. And they mostly go up for the type of workers that do these more manufacturing type of jobs and white collars. So if these were to be true, this is what happened in other pandemics. We don't know about this one. But if this were to be true, maybe this would be something that would reverse this trend that we have been observing in the last 3 decades of workers losing more and more power or more and more percentage of the GDP compared to capital. That might happen. So this is something that, it's interesting, it's out there, and it has happened in previous pandemics. Another thing that we see is that the interest rates remain low for a very long time. Okay, and in this sense, if we want to think positive about that, then that means that the fiscal policies that we are seeing, this massive government spending that it's needed for these situations, is actually maybe less of a problem, if you want, if the cost of financing that is a little bit lower.
Núria, thank you so much. I want to go to some questions because I don't want to not answer the questions. And you kind of looked at the whole world. We have a couple of questions about Europe, and just to name three of them. One is will the Eurozone monetary union hold up? Another one asks about are we destined to see Euro bonds? And someone asked very specifically if Spain's going to need a bailout from Europe, and what do you think the conditions might be? You probably can't answer the last question, but if you could talk a little bit about how all this might play out in Europe, I think that would be very helpful.
So regarding the first question, my feeling is absolutely yes. Yes, the Euro zone is going to hold up. And actually, if you look at what has happened in the last crisis, actually, yes, it took us a while to react. But if you look at all the things that Europe has done since the crisis, they've been amazing, and they've been done very, very quickly. For example, in terms of monetary policy, after Mario Draghi said, we will do whatever it takes, then changes started happening very quickly. For example, we created the unique resolution system, the unique supervisory system under the ECB. So actually, we've had a big movement towards a massive, banking union right now in Europe, and these are very positive elements. Now, what we need is the next step, which is more fiscal integration. And it's true, we are still not seeing probably enough. That's my opinion. We are still not there. We see some steps.
You talk kind of nicely about the economic reaction. How about the healthcare reaction? Because we've had some other people on this series who thought that Europe could have been much more coordinated and acted much quicker to stop the crisis as it evolved on the healthcare side of the whole issue. Would you agree with that, or do you think they're also doing a good job on the healthcare side?
No, I think that actually when we talk about coordination, that's something that we need more of it in Europe, definitely, in many, many aspects. Part of this is because, it's many of us trying to decide at the same time on something. So that takes a while. But one of the things that I think we need to work very strongly, and that's what I mean when we think about the long run, I think that one of the things that are absolutely needed within all this fiscal spending is to take the necessary steps to make us more ready for the second wave, in case there's a second wave, which we don't know, or for another pandemic that could come at some moment. Okay, we need to start taking some steps in case the virus decides to come back, or in case something else happens, in the next short run. And now that the big crisis, it's kind of slowing down, that's when we need to get ready. Now we know that this is here and it's serious. We are not talking about the next 2 weeks, we are talking about the next 2 years.
And if we look around the world, there's a few questions about we talked about inequality in countries, but also inequality between countries. And then are there going to be winners and losers, on the planet? Is China going to win from this? Because, even though the virus started there, it's the number of cases, the number of deaths, et cetera, has been much more confined in China. The United States, which is a much more decentralized healthcare system, and the response, I think, from the White House has been, in my opinion, terrible anyway. The impact is going to be much worse. Do you think this is going to change our geoeconomic world order?
I think it's inevitable that something so massive and so global, it's going to change our geopolitics. Now, I'm not so clear on which direction. For example, let me give you 2 examples, okay? One is what happens with trade wars. Now I think that if anything, what we should do is, and maybe people will see the light, these are not helping us at all under this. What we need is more cooperation, not less. Okay, and maybe this will put the end to this. So that would be a good shift in the world order. On the other hand, that might make us a little bit less cooperative when we are fighting for scarce resources. It's definitely not the way to go, but it's hard to predict. Now, I also think that the countries that are going to get out of it, and I'm trying to answer your question, whether it's going to be China or not, I don't know. I think that the countries that will get out of it are the ones that, while we are trying to answer to this crisis, we don't forget that this crisis is going to be temporary for sure in healthcare. Once we have the vaccine or one treatment, the impact on health is going to be over, and then it's going to be about the economy and about our society. And there are some problems that we had before that we still have not answered to. For example, what happens to the aging of our populations? This will not have changed, and we still have not figured out how to tackle this issue. Or what's going to happen to the inequality?
Sorry, Núria, when you say it's not going to change because even though the number of deaths of older people is tragic, it's not enough to move the numbers. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, it's definitely a devastating impact on lives of many people, but I don't think it's going to change this type of pyramids. Actually, if you look at the pyramid that we have on the top left, I know that those who look at it in mobiles, maybe you cannot see this very big, but basically this is the pyramid of Spain. It looks like a pear where everybody is actually, in theory right now, working age. But then after 20 years, all these people are going to be up, and we'll have a very few small number of our children there working when we are retired, for example. Okay, these are things that require structural changes, and we still have not figured that out. So which country is going to be successful in the long run? The ones that can still get back and answer the important questions. One is this one, for example. The other one is what happens with inequality. Okay, there was a lot of discontent and a lot of pressures that we had in our economies even before that we kind of have put up to rest because this crisis is too important to talk about anything else. But once we can kind of figure it out, this problem is going to continue being there. And now it's going to be the time when we have to find solutions in the long run for people that can be left out with this crisis. So we need to do something about it. Which country is going to be successful? The one that has an answer for this. And another one, can we keep attracting talent into our countries? Because if something we've learned from this crisis is that talent is key. We need people that can work and do their best in saving life, people that can do their best in retail and providing for all of us, people that can do their best in figuring out ways in research, innovation, that basically can find imaginative ways of getting us out of this crisis. So,
yeah. On this issue of talent, interesting enough, we had this small panel of CEOs, and one of them said that he was basically blown away or very impressed by talent that he didn't know he had inside his company. People that were not on the radar screen, people that were not on the lists of high potentials, just coming up with amazing solutions. And in fact, he was planning on questioning how they actually make the lists because of all these people that they saw. So it was really heartfelt. There's a few questions, Núria, about when you get into the economy, and I know you do some work on the transformation of the economy along these trends. Is it going to be more better for SMEs is a question, or what's going to happen to them? Is it going to be more about digital companies, and are people going to work from home all the time from now on? What kind of changes do you see as you kind of get into more detail?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like we've got 10 years ahead in 2 weeks, kind of, in some of the things. So, some of the things that I think this crisis has done to us is to accelerate some of the trends that were already there. I'm thinking about the last part that you said, for instance, the digital transformation. Okay, before we were all more reluctant to try and do this stuff. Now we couldn't choose. Okay, that's it. It has happened very quickly. But on the other hand, it has also made us appreciate more what being far can do for you and what can it not do for you. Okay, so for example, I'm trying working from home. I have 2 kids at home. Well, it's not that easy, for many things. So I think that yes, we will see more flexibility on some things. It would have accelerated some trends, but still for me, the important question is, can we design the right labor markets and the right labor insurance structures that will allow us to do this type of thing, so that workers
and
can.
SMEs, can you talk a little bit about SMEs? We have a couple
Yes.
of different about
Mm,
from developed countries, from non-developed
yes.
countries. There's a fear that they won't be able to survive this shock, even if it's not too long, which will provoke a wave of bad debt in different places, and then add to the economic crisis.
I think SMEs are crucial for many things, especially, for example, in Europe, they are very important. When they start, they have a lot of all this innovation. Actually, it starts also in small companies. And one of the things that everybody agrees on is that it's super important that we are capable of putting the efforts that are necessary to keep these type of companies, not only the SMEs, but obviously they will be more financially constrained in general, so that they can be up and ready. We need to preserve them so that when they are ready, they can do business as usual. Now, of course, the more financially constrained they are, the more difficult this is going to be. Okay. And also, again, let me say, not all the SMEs are the same. So, for example, something that this crisis will have done to us is that it might change what we economists call relative prices. We might value some things more and some things relatively less. For example, for a while, proximity. We might value proximity in terms of products, not proximity, physical proximity, we might value less. Proximity in the production, we might value more. So all these SMEs that are related to retail, to local production, to finding solutions to make this production reach the customer, they might do actually much better than ever, even before,
Because
even
many
after
companies are
that.
rethinking their very long global supply chains, which have been shown to be at risk for disruption,
Exactly,
whether it's this
exactly,
disruption or something else. Nuria, I don't
exactly.
know if you saw it, but Noah Duval Harari, the author of *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*, he wrote a piece in the Financial Times a few weeks ago where he said that the world is actually coming to a choice, that this crisis will either bring us closer together and more cooperation and more trust, or this will be a boost in the arm to people who want to separate the world and build more walls and maybe use more digital technology to control the population, and that this is kind of a fork in the road for humanity. Now this is the guy who wrote *Sapiens*, so he's a little bit
Yeah.
more broad scale. Do you think that's a serious question, and what do you think the answer might be?
So I think it's a serious question in the sense that this makes us rethink many things. For example, let me give you the example of data. How okay are we with sharing our data? And actually, it's not a yes or no thing. It's not that I don't want to share my data. Maybe I want to if this can protect me from this crisis. So now we have many devices, and actually many governments, or even voluntarily, many people say, hey, I'm okay by giving the data in my phone, just telling everybody with whom I've been in contact with and whether this person has or not symptoms. Why? Because we believe that this is going to help the world find a solution for the disease and so on. Okay, so I think that if we can, what we can see is that people are willing to share the data if you can achieve a superior good somehow. Okay, so it's embedded there. Now, of course, this data can be used to control people. That's a very, very fine line between the two. But I think that this makes a difference. So that's why I think, yes, we need to decide. What are we going to do with it? It's okay to share this data right now when we are in an emergency, in the same way in which we should stop doing this type of things unless people are willing to, once we are not in the same emergency, for example. Okay, and that's where the decisions come up. And that's why I think it's so important the way in which we deal with this situation, because this is going to set up the basis of who we are in the future. And that's why I'm very optimistic about Europe, even though I know that some people are not, for the type of values, for the type of things that we are capable of doing. We have these universal healthcare systems, we have democracies, so I think that we can maybe change the role that Europe can have in the world by setting up some of the rules that can make this future world very reasonable and acceptable. I hope we can do that.
So to come back to your scenarios, how many scenarios do you think a senior manager or a CEO should be managing, and how would you label them if you said, hey, think about scenarios, think about 2 or 3, what would you recommend?
Okay, so I think that we cannot think about economic scenarios without thinking about the health scenario that it's behind. Okay, so let me give you three scenarios just to make it a plausible number, which are not necessarily the most reliable ones, but I think they can help us think a little bit about what we can have in mind. Back to normal in September. Okay, back to some normalcy in September would require some very serious advance in terms of containment therapies. Either we have lots of massive tests for everybody, or we have figured out a way in which we can have antivirals, or maybe we have discovered an already existing treatment for something else that could work for this disease. Okay, actually there are about 120 already existing treatments that are under scrutiny right now by different pharmaceutical companies and institutions, trying to see if we can use them to treat COVID. COVID.
President Trump is talking about a malaria drug, and
I know.
I'm not sure if there's any evidence behind what President Trump ever says, and I'm not sure if there's any in this case. But
there's
by the way,
some very tiny
everybody
evidence.
Everybody knows that I voted for the other. I voted for the lady, but that's okay. That's not important.
No, but actually this is an example of one of the very many components that are actually being studied right now. So the most important thing that we need to keep in mind right now is that the evidence that we have so far, even for the malaria one, is very anecdotal. So we need to do better than that if we think that this is going to be a solution for everybody. But this could maybe happen. Who knows? It's a wild card. If one of these things that we already have discovered and we have in production could work, we are talking about 4 to 6 month time frame maybe. So that's one scenario. Then there's the other scenario where we don't have that, but we have tests finally for most of the population. So those who test positive stay home, the rest go to work normally. Maybe we have an antiviral type of treatment that reduces the impact of the disease on people, and also it makes it less contagious and things like that. That could make it very plausible in a scenario where we all have business almost as usual back to January. If none of these things happen, then we have to look for the vaccine. And the vaccine might take a while. And I know that we've read many people saying maybe we will have something ready in shorter term. But if you think at what it would mean to have a vaccine that is secure, to put to people who are healthy, because that's what we are talking about. The vaccine is for healthy people, right? So that's one thing. We need to be very sure that this works, that it's effective and it's safe. And the next thing that is very important is we need to produce it in massive quantities, okay? So that might take another while. This would be the third scenario.
A while
okay?
being 18 months or 24 months.
Maybe. Again, I mean, first it's coming up with it and then producing it, and
then also testing it and looking for long-term effects, because there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that some of the vaccines we normally use produce tremendously negative side effects to some percentage of the population.
Exactly. So that's why I'm saying that the vaccine scenario for me, it's for what I know, and again, I'm not an expert in that, but listening at all the things that will need to be done, it's closer potentially to 18 than to 12. Okay, so for me, these are the three health scenarios. Now, with these three scenarios in mind, then we can come up with different scenarios that would match the economy. Business as usual in September comes very close to what the IMF has been seeing, at least for Spain. Okay, we have a very bad 2020, and then a recovery at the end of 2020 and big increase in 2021, where we would be recovering the GDP that we had pre-crisis, maybe about, in 1 year and a half or something like that. Okay. If this is not the case and we have a second spike in the end of the year, it means business as usual, maybe in January, February of next year. That makes it a little bit worse. So 2021, it's not going to be so amazing. It's going to be a little bit bad. Okay.
Well, let's stay with those two. I don't think we need the third one, because that's one of our comments. Just to share a comment with you, someone says that the passion with which you teach is healing. So that's just the energy and the optimism that you're giving is healing, and I think we all need some healing today. Núria Mas, thank you so much for joining the series that we've been trying to give out to the world. Remember, this session will be available on LinkedIn. It is being taped. You can play it later. You can send it to other people if you think. They're also available. All the sessions we've been doing are available on our IESE website, where we have a link, and you can watch all the different things we've been doing since the first one I did way back in early March in New York City. The world has changed a lot since then, so don't hold me accountable to what we said then, because now it's a different situation. The next one will be the chairman of our finance department, Carlos Vergara, on Monday, back at the 4 o'clock European Standard Time frame, where he's going to be talking a little bit about how some of these trends, which have come up in our conversation today, will affect different parts of the economy. So Núria Mas, thanks again for joining us. And thanks everybody for tuning into the program.
Thanks everybody. Bye. Thank you.